Welcome to the Two Disabled Dudes podcast. We believe life is about how we react. Welcome back to our drug development series. This is part 2. In part 1, episode 143, Barbara Tate kicked us off with an extensive overview of the process. Today, we're digging a little deeper. This episode focuses on how a company gets started after a discovery, and this is kind of a risky part of the process that requires experience, heart, and guts, all of which John Crowley brings to the table. John was gracious enough to join us for an in-depth conversation that we know you'll enjoy. However, I gotta warn you, there were some technical issues beyond my control the day we recorded. Thank you, AT&T. However, although I had to make do with what we had, this should not detract from the content. Besides, focusing in on John's voice is probably the better route to go anyway, so enjoy.
So what's amazing about this guest today, I feel like Kyle and I have hit the jackpot. Like the Queen of England herself maybe has joined us on the show. Yep. And I'm willing to bet to most of our listeners, if not all, John Crowley needs no real introduction. And we're just honored to have John joining us today. John, welcome to the show.
Yeah, Sean, it's great to join you and Kyle. And I have to tell you, quite candidly, that's the first time I've been compared to Her Royal Majesty. So I actually kind of like it, and I'm pretty humbled. So thank you.
Well, John, we've been looking forward to the conversation. Not only do I feel like you're a celebrity because of the film that's centered around your life, but just who you are, the way you carry yourself, the way you are committed to making the best out of life for yourself and your family and those that you're able to interact with and work on behalf of. You've definitely made a mark on this planet, and we're honored to be a small part of that.
Well, look, it's honored to be here, and it's been such a great treat getting to know you two guys. Again, right back at you. You talk about a spirit and an ability to live your life despite all or any challenges. We all learn from each other in this community. Yep. We all learn from each other. So great to be here and eager to get your guys' questions.
John, we're going to start off with your top 5.
Thanks, Kyle. You know what I'll do is I'll share my leadership principles, and they're ones that I learned early in my journey at the Naval Academy and then into my military career. And there are a lot of principles of leadership from the military that are applicable to our everyday lives and to running a business, particularly a biotech company. But there are 5 that I'll highlight that I think are particularly applicable to what we do every day. And especially as I look back over the last year, running a company through the midst of this COVID crisis. So first is you got to be transparent, always. You got to be honest with yourself, with your team, your organization. If something is tough, if it doesn't go well, which oftentimes is the case in our world of biotech, you got to tell people for what it is. Don't sugarcoat. Just tell them, look, this is what we did. This is what happened. This is what we found. And this is what we're going to do next. So transparency is one. Secondly, is you've got to be highly visible, particularly in a crisis. People want to know and see and hear from the leader. They want to see that confidence, no matter what the challenge is. And again, getting back to the first principle of transparency, don't sugarcoat. But secondly, you got to be visible, highly visible to everybody. You got to go deep in the organization. Third is focus. Sometimes we want to achieve so much. And especially in a crisis, I think it's really important to get back to the principles. I was honored in my military career as an intelligence officer to work with some of the greatest warriors in the world in the Navy SEAL teams and the Spec Ops communities. And what amazed me with all the folks in that community is that focus, just always thinking about the task at hand. Don't worry about what you got to do later in the day or down the road. Just get through this. We used to say, get through this evolution. So third, focus. And for me, that's, oftentimes meaning taking really grand ambitions and just scaling them down, frankly, to a couple of bullet points and just execute. I think the fourth is you got to balance empathy and performance. I really believe that empathy is the greatest trait that a leader can have to feel the hope or the fear of another. And you've got to balance that with performance that, our organizations, whatever it may be, whether you're a one-person shop or a small patient foundation or small startup company or a large organization, you've got a plan and you've got to deliver. I think it gets to the core of what we've tried to develop at Amicus, that we have a dual mission, first and foremost for patients, and secondly for our shareholders, but they're perfectly aligned missions. If we could make the best drugs and get them to as many people as quickly as possible, we'll be doing this for a very long time. So performance and empathy. And the last is you got to be fearless. When I was a little boy growing up, my dad was a police officer, and he used to drive me to kindergarten every day in his police car. And when you're 5 years old, it's pretty cool pulling up in the cop car. And every now and again, I'd flip the lights and siren and get a little attention. But my dad would tell me every day, he'd say the words, "Do right," and I'd have to finish it with saying, "And fear no man." And that's as much about yourself as it is about those that you interact with. What we do in our world here requires each of us to be fearless, to take risks, smart risks, hopefully, but to kind of lean into the challenge. I think as Winston Churchill said, lean into the challenge creatively and aggressively. So you got to be fearless. So those are my 5 leadership principles.
I like them all. And one that sticks out to me is when you talk about focus on the task at hand, I if I were to relate that to my disability or FA, there's so much reality in that, right? But when you think of the coordination and the lack of muscle control and different things, when I'm trying to haul things from the car to the house or even just manage a stairwell, I've got to stay focused on one step at a time and focus on that particular task at hand. So it even, to me, it applies to not only just leadership and influence, but in our day-to-day as well.
Absolutely. I mean, you look at, this has been written about for a long, long time in human history, and you really can't change human nature. And I think the best of human nature oftentimes is around that notion of focus, which also means living in the present. We spend a lot of our life with regrets, things that we wished we had done, places we had gone, people we had spent more time with. And you can't dwell on that. You can't dwell on that. We also spend a lot of our time worrying about the future. And one of my favorite quotes is from Mark Twain, something to the effect that, I've come to know a great amount of suffering in my life, much of which never came to pass. And especially in this COVID world in the last year, uncertainty brings anxiety. And these have been unbelievably uncertain times, personally, professionally, financially, spiritually, for everybody. But I think those that have gotten through it the best have just said, you know what, let's focus on the task at hand. Let me get through this meeting. Let me get through this hour today, this doctor appointment, whatever it may be. It's great. You got a plan. That doesn't mean just, live entirely in the present. You got a plan, but
sure.
to just appreciate those moments and live in the present and solve the task at hand. And yes, if it means literally one step at a time for somebody like you living with a physical challenge, Sean or Kyle, then yeah, absolutely. And I see it in my kids and Patrick and Megan every day. So I agree.
I think the other thing about your list as a whole is that all these things kind of reinforce each other.
I think so. I think you're right, Kyle. I think they're actually very interdependent.
Right. Yeah.
John, one of the things that we want to talk about, obviously, we want to get into your personal story and share a little bit about you and your family, especially for those listeners that maybe don't know the Queen of England, or John Crowley.
And
maybe
haven't. We're literally going to stop that now because this is how nicknames take off. And I've had plenty. That's fine.
Okay, you're right.
That's
all right.
No. Old worse. Keep going.
Just in seeing the film that is centered around your story, Extraordinary Measures, I think about the elements of the film where you just go all in on Dr. Stonehill and your family. And in a sense, you were fearless. I'm sure deep down you were scared. There was some anxiety about jeopardizing the safety net for your family. But even that fifth principle you share, be fearless, that certainly comes to life in the film. So if you don't mind, go back in your family personal history and share with our listeners about the disease that has ravaged your family and what you and your wife have done to combat that.
Yeah, I think like each of us in the community, we live with a disease. We try to thrive despite the challenges. And it's kind of a classic story for each of us that we never expected this. Oftentimes in the rare genetic diseases, of course, there's no history in a family. And it just strikes like somebody early in our family's journey told me that nature is not cruel, just brutally random. And it was for us. I was a year at a business school in the late 90s. And we had our older son, John, who does not have Pompe disease, although we found out later John lives with Asperger's. So John has his own unique set of challenges and gifts. But then with our second, Megan, she was seemingly perfectly healthy, but by a year of age wasn't taking her first steps, wasn't pulling up in a crib. And we went over a couple of months from doctor to pediatrician to neurologist, from blood tests to muscle biopsy to results. And, my greatest fear was in those couple of months going down this diagnostic odyssey was that Megan may never walk, that she may need a wheelchair. And I couldn't imagine how awful that would be. So you could imagine how devastating it was on that Friday the 13th in March in 1998 when the neurologist had us in his office and said they had the results of the pathology in Megan's muscle, and it showed the buildup of glycogen, a stored form of sugar. And he said she had a glycogen storage disease, a lysosomal disorder known as Pompe disease. I didn't know what any of those words meant. And we were just in shock. And I remember asking the doctor, is it serious? And he said, yes, it's very serious. And he said, and I'm thinking, my God, maybe she really will need a wheelchair. And he said, she may not live to be 2. She was 15 months old at the time. Wow. And then he looked down. Megan wasn't with us, Eileen and I, but our son, our youngest, Patrick, who was 7 days old, was there in his car carrier. And the doctor said he needs to be tested. There's a 25% chance he had the disease as well. And I think like many of us, we went through the shock, the grief, the denial, the anger. And by that evening settled on determination. I think first determined to learn everything we could about the disease, what the state of research was, and then eventually determined to do everything we could to try to change the course of that. And I'll spare everybody maybe the whole journey, but in time over the next couple of months, the kids did get very, very sick. And within 6 months, Megan needed to be on a ventilator and was in the ICU for 7 weeks. And Patrick, we went through all of that again 6 months later with him. And so in the course of a year, we had home with us 2 little kids on ventilators full time with a very precarious future. And that kind of led us into the world of first not-for-profit fundraising, literally the nights and weekends and bake sales and walkathons, all the way to finally saying, kind of screw it. We're gonna join forces with a researcher and try to start a little company, because that's the only way I knew to raise millions, maybe tens of millions of dollars potentially. So I kind of became an accidental entrepreneur in biotech. And I think more than anything, I never thought it would succeed in any way. I think we just didn't, Eileen and I didn't want to ever look back and wished that we had done more, or wished we had done something different. We didn't, again, in the spirit of just never have any regrets.
Right.
That's what we wanted. And thankfully, we were able, with the help of some great scientists and eventually within Genzyme at the time, to develop an enzyme replacement therapy that began to save the kids' lives. And that's kind of the first part of the journey. I'll maybe in a moment share with you, with everybody, where the kids are today.
John, what I think is a remarkable thing, you said within the course of a day or so, you settled on determination. Many of us get to that point. For me, it took me 2 years to even be able to talk about FA with my parents. I've talked about it before on the podcast, but I just think it's remarkable the amount of time, saying that it took you 1 day to get to determination. You know what? Even if that was 6 months, or I guess you didn't have the luxury of time, right? And maybe that's part of what played into it.
We didn't. There was a great sense of urgency. I mean, literally every day that we didn't move the ball forward, we felt we were behind. It's a race against the clock. It's right. I think, Kyle, it's a race against time as much as it is a race against nature.
So, John, before you talk about where the kids are now, obviously Amicus is a part of that journey. So will you give us just a little glimpse of the maybe the business side, I guess, if we can call it that, I suppose, of what your career has looked like?
Yeah, when we started that first company, that was fast. It was 18 months start to finish before we sold it to Genzyme, and I was at Genzyme just under a year and a half. And I took some time. I worked in a venture capital firm, looked at some really cool biotech ideas, and thought about what I wanted to be, and was actually getting back into the Navy at the time. And it was after 9/11, and I wanted to step up and make a small contribution there, and then realized I can do that in the Navy Reserve with some active duty commitments along the way. So did that. But after about the first year and a half, the first medicine that Megan and Patrick took, while it fixed the enlargement of their hearts, and for a while it made them, especially Megan, stronger, it began to plateau. And then they kind of began that inexorable decline and losing the muscle strength they had gained. And I realized that we weren't done and I needed to go back to the drawing board. But I also took some time to reflect, and I had met a lot of families with a lot of rare diseases in those couple of years. And I realized just how little hope some of them had. And frankly, how much, especially among, people with the most severe diseases, many of them children, just enormous amounts of suffering. And you think about, and I also was seeing some incredibly exciting science, and thought, well, we were only one or two really rare disease focused companies back then. In fact, for a while, it was Genzyme and TKT, or Shire as it became. Then you had BioMarin just getting going with Emil and his team. And so I said, there's room for plenty more Genzymes, and I'd like to create one. And that was really the notion of building Amicus. While yes, we would have a Pompeii program, we'd have many programs. And while, yes, we'd start on one particular technology to begin, we would scour the universe for the best technologies for years. And so we started the company. We chose the name Amicus. We wanted to be the most patient-friendly, patient-focused company in biotech. So we picked the Latin name for friend. And we said we would always be business-led, but science-driven, with patients at the heart of everything we do. And it's infused in our culture in a way that it's just so part of our fabric. And I can give you a lot of examples, but I think one example is just the mindset. And I ask everybody at Amicus to think with every decision, if you had this disease, whatever it may be, or you were the mom or dad of a kid with the disease, what would you do? Who would you hire? Where would you invest your capital, your time, your reputation? Where would you build a manufacturing facility? Whatever the decision may be, when would you start a program? When would you stop a program, which is a hard decision? And that, I think, set us apart. We also said we'd go after some of the most challenging diseases, which made our journey long and arduous at times. And we said we'd, in many cases, try to, be the first to try in some diseases where there were nothing, or in diseases like Pompe or Fabry, where there were early treatments, we try to do better. And, and it's hard too in these diseases. You do these clinical studies and you're the first up. It's hard enough to beat placebo in the rare diseases. Going up against approved therapies and trying to show superiority sometimes is a really tall order, but it's one that we tackled. And so with Amicus, we went from 5 of us in 2005, starting the company. And today, 16 years later, we're over 500 people in 27 countries. We have an approved precision medicine for Fabry disease. We have a very late stage program that we intend to take through its submissions and hopefully launch for next generation Pompe therapy, and a whole range of gene therapies for some really severe diseases like Batten disease and others. So I'm really proud of what we've built, but we've got a long way to go still.
You talk about being the first in a disease and developing these technologies. How do you decide which technology to take forward or which disease to move forward in when you get to that point? I mean, I'm sure a lot goes into it, but maybe what are the top few things that really contribute to that decision?
I'll give you an example, Kyle, of how we came into the gene therapy space. I was aware of gene therapy from the early days of our kids being diagnosed. In fact, within a couple of weeks of their diagnosis, I was reading all these academic papers, and I read one on gene therapy in Pompe. And I called the researcher and asked some probably pretty naive questions in retrospect, but I asked, when could it be in clinical studies? And he said a year, maybe 2. That was 1998. It took more than 2 decades to get to the point of actually getting Pompe gene therapies to patients. And even then, we're just in the very early days. But once I saw a couple of years ago that they were starting to work, that some of the early fundamental challenges in gene therapy were being addressed, and you saw results in diseases, like SMA type 1 with the Avexis Novartis molecule, with Sparks molecule, and a rare eye disease, I started to think that, we need to be in gene therapy. If we're going to be a world's leading company in genetic medicine, we need to be in gene therapy, with knowing that there's still lots of challenges to solve. So what we did there, there's so many technologies. When I asked our team is to start with the diseases. We started with a list. It took about a year of the project, while in parallel, we were looking at technologies. We started with about 1,000 diseases. We winnowed that list down to 100, eventually 15 that we first prioritized. And then we went out and looked for technologies that would fit those diseases. And in looking at the diseases, we thought about the extent of the unmet need. In no case were we afraid of a disease because it was too hard or too devastating. So for us, that, in fact, a criteria was that these be very severe diseases. In terms of patient populations, we can go down pretty small. It used to be, it was hard to make the business case work if there were fewer than a couple of thousand patients. Really rare used to be considered 5,000, 10,000 patients in a addressable population. Now we think that's down into the hundreds, especially with gene therapy. So it's challenging when you get to the really ultra rare diseases, the N of ones, or where there's a couple of dozen kids. But what we're actually finding there is, for most of those diseases, once you start screening, you're going to find a lot more kids. Yeah. CDKL5 deficiency disorder, CDD, is a great example of that. Used to be thought to be a small variant of Rett. Turns out there's now thousands of kids diagnosed with that disease. So when we looked at the diseases, those were kind of the key criteria. And then it was finding the technology that would fit best, including technologies that we could bring to bear. We're experts in protein engineering. In gene therapy, we think it's very important to not only have the most cutting edge gene therapies, but to be able to understand and manipulate the proteins being expressed by those gene therapies. If you can do that, you could better target the protein. You could use a lower dose of gene therapy, particularly in viral delivery. You'll also make it much more manufacturable. So all those factors start to come to play that bring us to a portfolio ultimately. And then what you need to do is you can't just say, well, okay, we made these bets, we spent all this money, we've invested all this time, maybe credibility. Well, these are the programs, so let's go forward for the next decade or so. You literally certainly semi-annually, we do it about quarterly, to ask really hard questions. Are we where we need to be? Do we need to step back and do more fundamental science? Or do we need to completely pivot and look for a whole new approach, maybe even a technology that's not yet invented? Knowing when to pause these programs is really important because the opportunity costs here are pretty severe.
When you face the question or ask the question, are we where we need to be? What are maybe one or two or maybe three things that are the deciding factor? Are you talking in terms of, are we hitting the mark for investors? Or are we hitting the mark on the research side? Are we seeing the needle move in such a manner that we expected? What are some of those milestones that you're looking for as you proceed down this road of advancing that technology?
To me, those are really technical. You're focused in the technical areas in science, in medicine. It's three areas, very simple. Is it likely to be effective? Is it likely to be safe? And is it likely to be manufacturable? Those are all, you need to answer all three of those questions in drug development constantly. And those are the questions we try to ask. We'll manage budgets and timelines, invest, all of our stakeholder expectations, whether they be patients, investors, regulators. We'll work and manage those. But fundamentally, a drug has to be safe, effective, and manufacturable.
How does the patient voice play into all that? I mean, we're talking lots of money, we're talking lots of science. When you think about the patient voice and the patient influence on the process, how do you actively keep the patient at the center when there's all these different factors that you've been talking about?
I think a couple different ways. One, we bring patients in regularly to tell their family journey and story in what we call lunch and learns. In a COVID world, we do them routinely by Zoom. In fact, you guys have been wonderful at helping facilitate many of these for us. We've done over 100 in our history at Amicus. And they build part of our story, our journey. The patient portraits that we have throughout the company, they're constantly literally in our face, so we can't forget. But it's more than that, though. It's, I have a chief patient advocate who you guys know well, Jane Gershkowitz, who's a dear friend and I think the greatest leader in being the voice for patients in our entire industry. Jane and her team at Amicus are the conscience of the company. And we all try to live that patient view. But Jane is always there to remind us to be that ombudsman, to ask those questions. Jane reports directly to me, sits on our executive committee, attends our board of directors meeting, always bringing that patient perspective. We also have patient advisory boards. Each company has, they'll have a scientific advisory board, they'll have medical advisory boards. We have those too. But for each of our diseases, including diseases that we're not even yet in clinical stage, we have patient advisory boards. People living with the disease or the parents of kids with the disease. We put them under confidentiality. We don't pay them, but we share with them a lot of what we're doing, a lot of it confidential strategies. We did this 6 years ago in our Pompeii program, a year before we dosed our first patient, when we were coming up with the protocols. Before we took it to our medical advisory experts in our MAB, we had about a dozen Pompeii patients, including for the first time my daughter Megan, when she turned 18, and they they ripped the protocols apart.
Mm-hmm.
They went through and they're like, look, 6-minute walk test and forced vital capacity and MIP and MEP and all that, that may be good, but this is relevant. That's not. What about people in wheelchairs? Kind of the real stuff that mattered. And in fact, I remember Megan telling folks, she said 2 things really mattered to me. She said, first, if I could breathe for 1 minute without my ventilator, because Megan knows, it's an issue with the vent that could be life-threatening.
Right.
And then the second thing she said was, if I could learn to speak more clearly so that when I go to college, I could make more friends. These are the things that make a difference for people living with these challenges. And for us, it wasn't just to be compassionate or empathetic. And yeah, there's some of that, but more than anything, it's good business because it makes our programs better and stronger by listening to the patients. These are what any other business would call your customers. So it's kind of a basic, it's something I learned in like marketing 101, right? So there's no real magic to it. It's just the right thing to do. And I will tell you, I'm increasingly optimistic that this is the mindset that the whole industry is adopting. Maybe we were a little ahead of the curve and with a few others, but I'm really encouraged by what I'm seeing and hearing. You go back to the 21st Century Cures Act that President Obama signed into law at the end of his term in 2016, and it specifically mandated the FDA and regulators to take into account the patient voice, patient perspectives. Yeah. Every single FDA meeting that we have, we bring patient representatives and we allocate the first 5 minutes for them to speak. Sometimes scripted, sometimes unscripted, and to be available to answer any questions from the regulators. It's made our programs better.
I would imagine if you think back 10 or 15 years ago, the patient voice wasn't necessarily loud and clear at those FDA meetings. Have you seen a specific or tangible change in the way the FDA responds because they got to hear directly from the patient?
Oh, absolutely. I'll give you an example. We had, as about maybe a year and a half ago or so, we were having an exchange, an in-person meeting with the FDA on our Pompe program. And we brought a patient representative, and it was a busy room, tons of FDA people. We had a lot of people. We were all around this big table, very formal meeting, people lining the sides. And when it was time to begin, we began, and the young lady, who she and her sister both had Pompe, it was her time to speak. She began speaking, and she had prepared her comments. And the medical lead at FDA leaned forward, and she said, "Would you please step up to the table?" And then motioned to us from Amicus to make room, right? She said, "You step up to the table. We work for you." I was very impressed. I was very, very impressed with that. And it kind of froze the room on both sides. For me, honestly, because I was embarrassed that I didn't have her sitting up there with us. So I made room, and she sat right next to me. And I think for the people from the agency, I think they took note of the importance of that coming from the physician who was in charge of the meeting on their side. So that's just one, small vignette of what I've seen as progress forward. We still have a lot more to do. I think you'll see disparities still among the reviewing divisions at the agency, but increasingly open to the patient perspective.
We just have to be vigilant, right? Because I think oftentimes those things are unconscious, right? We have to stay on top of making sure the patients stay at the front.
Absolutely.
It's a constant pressure, right? It's not just going to happen because we say it. We got to stay on it.
I couldn't agree more.
The squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? So it's not so much demanding, but it's not going away. It's just
right.
Keep knocking on the door.
Well, you're actually seeing it. I've seen a couple of cases where the FDA has proactively reached out to patient groups and asked them to come in without the sponsors, without the companies, to come in and talk. Outside of the formal, we now have, with the 21st Century Cures Act, the PFDDs, the patient-focused drug development forums. Those are excellent, very helpful. You kind of get them once. They're very formal, but much more of the informal interaction. We need a lot more of it. Mm-hmm. But I'm starting to see some of that changed. I I would be thrilled to see that Dr. Woodcock and her leadership continue at the agency. I think that's been fantastic for patients and for science.
A follow-up to the question about how you incorporate patient advocacy into patient voice into your business, what do you think are the big challenges? Like, why is that just not just a common practice? Why does it need to be a conscious effort to do that? Like you said, you're serving customers. And so what are the factors that make that not happen automatically?
I think there's a lot of history, Kyle. I think if you look, clinical researchers were kind of classically trained that patients should be numbers because that's better science. And you don't want to bias results. You don't want to confuse studies. We need to know if medicines are safe and effective. I've always had a different view. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think you need to know, especially in the rare diseases, you need to know the patients, their journeys, and understand really what it's like to live, to walk in their shoes. So I think there's some of that historical. I think also, too, there have been examples from time to time where people have unfairly levered or taken advantage of individual patients or patient communities. Some of these are really tough diseases and just horrific and just shocks, kind of your human empathy. Some people have crossed the line over the years. So I think there is a view that, well, if you're taking patients in, you must not have good data or science. And I firmly push back on that. They have to go hand in hand.
John, I want to ask you probably $1 million question.
$1 million's a really big number, Sean, right? Okay. All right. Let me be clear. I know you guys aren't really math guys per se, so. but go ahead.
In a lot of cases, folks facing rare disease or disability, they don't have a lot of resources at their disposal. So a question that I imagine a lot of our listeners are curious about, and overall, pharma in general gets a bad rap because a lot of drugs can be expensive, and a lot of insurance companies, their third parties, payers, make it hard to get access to these kind of drugs. So I'm curious if you're okay talking about it from your perspective as you pursue treatments and cures and therapies. How do you balance the good business that you speak of, or the profitability to keep your business sustainable, with the patient's ability to have access to those therapies?
Oh, I think it's an incredibly important topic. And for me, for us, we at Amicus, pricing and access go hand in hand. When we, even when we formed the company back in 2005, long before we had an approved product, we built, we had a value statement. I wrote the first 2 words, "we believe," and the rest of the company filled in the other 24 or so bullet points. One of which said, we believe that our medicines must be fairly priced and broadly accessible. And we live that today. And it, when it came time to price our first medicine, consultants said we should price it maybe a little premium to existing products. We looked at it and we asked the questions, what would provide the fastest and broadest access? And I'll give you examples of what we did outside the United States. We said that medicine would be priced at parity to existing therapies, even though it was an orally available medicine instead of an infusion. And that alone would save health authorities tens of thousands of dollars per patient per year in foregone infusion costs. We said the system can keep those economics. And actually, you look in the United Kingdom, the reviewing body there, the NICE authorities, they in their approval for our medicine, they noted the clinical benefits, but they also noted the economic benefits. In the United States, we actually chose to price below the existing standard of care. We also, when you look at the price of medicines, oftentimes it's not even the initial price, it's the annual price increases. At times, less so the last couple of years, but for a while, they were extraordinarily unfair. And particularly in the rare diseases where you get somebody on life-saving therapy and then you got them. And you can't do that. So what we committed to We said no Amicus medicine would ever see an annual price increase greater than the consumer price index, which, as you know, for the last number of years has been about 2% per year. Last year, we took zero price increase during COVID. So, these principles help a lot. Copays, I believe fundamentally that copays should go away, certainly in the diseases that we care about. They were started years ago so that patients would have, skin in the game. You're going to tell somebody with a rare genetic disease or a cancer or an autoimmune disease that they don't have enough skin in the game. So let's just do away with the copays, and we'll absorb those economics. These are expensive medicines. It takes, our two lead medicines have each taken more than $500 million and more than a decade to develop. So we've got to find ways to shorten the time frame, to reduce the amount invested. We need to think about more advanced regulatory paradigms. We need more competition, innovation. The Orphan Drug Act has been great, and it provides for 7 years of marketing exclusivity, which is a good market incentive to provide research in very rare diseases. But what happens is you give a monopolist a 7-year head start in a small market, they're going to own that market for decades. Mm-hmm. And we need to find ways to bring second generation therapies and third and fourth and ultimately cures to patients. So I'm a big believer in the free enterprise system. We just need to play it fairly.
You mentioned that some of your first two therapies, I think you said, roughly $500 million and over a decade in development. Would you say that's on par? Like, is that somewhat average for a therapy, or?
Even a rare disease therapy, yes, absolutely. Some, many more.
With that in mind, we've mentioned COVID, and the whole series that we're talking about today, or one of the reasons why we have you on, is to sort of touch on all the big elements of drug development overall. We talked about COVID and the last year that we've all experienced worldwide. Seeing a vaccine come about pretty rapidly, and then overall the different therapeutics and companies that all played a part in either an element of research or an element of actually going to market, like Pfizer and Moderna. Do you think COVID-19 and its impact on the world has had an impact on the developmental process overall for drugs moving forward?
I think it certainly has in COVID-19. I think it has broadly in the vaccine field, and I'm hopeful more broadly in drug development, Sean. You think about the principles underlying what we did, and I have to tell you, this really is our finest hour as an industry. You look at the pharmaceutical industry, big pharma that had been oftentimes maligned over the years, oftentimes stubbing itself, its big toe a lot. But these are people who really cared, who got together to solve a problem and did it with the most remarkable science, with the most remarkable human compassion. I think about when our kids just last month got the first and then second dose of the Pfizer vaccine, that palpable sense of relief that, God willing, they're not going to get COVID. I mean, that is real hope. I actually emailed a picture of my daughter, Megan, getting that. I sent it to Albert Bourla, who's the CEO of Pfizer, who's a remarkable leader and an incredibly compassionate leader as well, and just thanked him. And I said, just so you see that the real face of what these medicines, these vaccines can bring. So I think it's terrific. And I'm hopeful that we'll take some of these lessons forward, because you think about in COVID, what did we think about? We think about, number one, we needed a vaccine or vaccines that were highly safe and effective, and we got it. We thought, secondly, we never thought about, well, who can afford it and who can't, and that's who'll get it. No, we said everybody needs it. We never questioned 100% access. And that means global access, by the way, not just in the States. And third was time. We hoped eventually we'd make a vaccine, we'd turn the tide against COVID-19, but we knew we needed to beat time. Every day we saw the death toll. We still see it. So great medicine, safe and effective, access and time. That's what we think about every day in developing rare disease medicines.
Yeah.
We just don't yet have a regulatory framework that works in that way. And we need to get to that. We need that sense of urgency. We're getting there. We're not there yet.
I love how you talk about that in the aspect of pride for what the industry has done, right?
Oh, it's remarkable.
There's been a
Yeah.
lot of reasons to be ashamed of what the industry has done because that's what comes out in the media, right?
No, there have been bad actors, there have been bad policies, but there's been a lot of good, and sometimes that gets overlooked. And thankfully, Kyle, we're finally getting the recognition. I hope as an industry we don't squander it.
John, I want to be respectful of your time, but I want to give you a chance to update us on Megan and Patrick and life at home. Would you mind sharing with us?
So May, our older son, John, healthy son, is 26. Megan is 24. Patrick is 23. Megan and Patrick both went through the public school systems in Princeton, New Jersey, where we lived for a long time. And Megan then left home in 2015 to go out to South Bend, Indiana, to start her freshman year at Notre Dame with some degree of hesitation. I was worried the nights that I was downstairs in my study and she was upstairs with her nurse. I had to think that she'd be 600 miles away. And she did it, and she graduated in 4 years, spent each of her more than 1,000 nights in her dorm room in Ryan Hall. Ryan Hall was donated by the Ryan family, who had a son with cerebral palsy who had graduated with Notre Dame, and they wanted a female dorm on campus with chapel and resident priest that would be suitable for physically disabled students. So Megan did that. She graduated in May of 2019 with a double major, and she's now completing, almost complete, with a master's in social work at UNC Chapel Hill in North Carolina. And Megan wants to be a social worker and work with children with rare diseases. Our Patrick, after finishing high school, did some post-high school studies, and he now works in a flower shop in Princeton. And I think for each of our kids, I told this to Megan when she went away. In fact, she was about 6 weeks into her studies, just overwhelmed. And I told her, I said, honey, all we ever wanted for you is to be happy, safe, and fulfilled. And she has been and continues to lead a great life, and now giving back to others. People may look at the kids in wheelchairs on ventilators and take pity, and they don't on themselves. They never feel sorry for themselves. You guys sure as hell don't, and for yourselves, and you shouldn't. And think think of the power to contribute to this world in so many different ways. And that's what's exciting. And I think, you guys were teasing early on and about the Queen of England. When Megan got a car, of course, we have to, or a nurse has to drive it, got a handicapped minivan. And she said, Dad, she said, can I get personalized plates? I said, yeah, I guess. What do you want? She said, the Royal Princess Megan. I'm like, all right. First of all, you get like 24 letters on your license plate. There's how many? I'm like, I don't know. You get like 6, maybe 7. So she got instead HRH Meg is her license plate. Her Royal Highness Meg. So quite a confident young lady too. So that may be my only link. That may be my only link to royalty, guys. Sorry to disappoint, but they're great. Amazing. And you know what? We're just living life.
I love your story, John, because you talked about being converted to determination after getting all this difficult news, and I think I see that in your whole family, and I love that your whole family is the leader of Amicus. I feel like when we've had the pleasure to work with you guys, everyone talks so highly of your entire family, and I think that extends to your company. And I just think that's remarkable that your people are your family.
They are. That's one of the 24 bullet points we wrote, that families are part of our experience.
And speaking of bullet points, earlier you were talking about how you wrote the first 2 words, we believe. And I remember having the opportunity to walk through your headquarters, or what used to be the headquarters in New Jersey, and seeing signs all over the building, not only pictures of patients and families, like you mentioned, but also words that remind everybody on the team what you're doing, what your mission is, how you're going to get there, where you're going, and a lot of those core values. And it's obvious that, like Kyle says, your team and your family embodies every element of the work that you all are doing.
Thank you, guys. I wished I knew 20 years ago when I started out in this field what I've learned now, and what I think I know now. I still have much to learn, but unfortunately, we tend to have to suffer our way to wisdom in life, or some small measure of it. But I'm really proud of the company and the team that we've built, and just, frankly, so humbled by all the people we get to meet along this journey. It's been a blessing. It's been a blessing. Thank you, guys. Be well. Stay strong.
Holy cow, what a powerful conversation.
No joke.
Right? I appreciate John's friendly nature too. Not only is he incredibly smart and influential and successful in what he's doing, and he's just got all the right pieces, but not only that, he's willing to give me a hard time, and I appreciate that. I don't know if we may have laughed a little bit, but his little 1 million's a big number. I think he was making fun of me. That was him.
You think so?
Giving me a hard time, which is well deserved, because in the few opportunities we've had to work with him, I did not hold back.
Yeah, he's a lot of fun, man. I really admire how well spoken and thoughtful, like every word he says is like chosen specifically, I feel like, and I really admire that. And I'm just grateful to have leaders like him leading the charge in the rare disease space.
Absolutely. One thing I enjoyed learning, Kyle, was hearing how Amicus got its name. I never knew that it was the Latin word for friend, and I really, really value the root there.
Yeah, I was feeling like I should have known that, but I didn't.
Yeah. Well, we know the series is going to be a little bit longer than normal, so let's wrap this up with our thank you notes as always.
My thank you note comes from this episode, actually. John mentioned Jane Gershkowitz, and like you said, we've had a chance to work with her, and I've seen her at conferences and stuff, rare disease conferences, and she is always just so welcoming and warm, and she is also down to business. She knows her stuff, man, and it's just another one of those really incredible leaders that we have in the rare disease space, so I appreciate Jane Gershkowitz.
Can't agree with you more, and I echo the thank you. I'm glad you mentioned that. I'm going to throw one out for a friend of mine. A couple of us co-workers went out, and he paid for lunch just out of the blue. No significant reason, just wanted to be kind, and I appreciate that. So thank you, Umberto. Thank you, Jane. And, of course, thank you, John, for giving us a bit of your time. We're hoping you're enjoying this series. We've got more coming at you next week with episode 145. In the meantime,
keep living with urgency. Thank you for listening to the Two Disabled Dudes podcast. This show is possible with your support. Visit twodisableddudes.com to donate.
Connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app.